let me just welcome you here on behalf of the Asia Center. My name is Andrew Gordon, and I'm a historian of modern Japan, and was a couple of years ago the acting director of the Harvard Asia Center. And I got to know Stefan maybe 3 or 4 years ago for the first time. So let me turn it over to Stefan, and he'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about a half an hour for discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy, for the kind introduction. And I should mention this presentation is based on a paper that I'm currently working on, which is related to my larger research project on ocean colonization during the 20th century. Yeah, when humanities and social science scholars contemplate about the connection between climate change and the ocean, there seems to be a tendency to view the ocean as a relatively passive space. Among the negative results of this biogeophysical transformation of the ocean caused by climate change are sea level rise, ocean acidification, ocean warming, and so on. You probably have heard about all that. However, in this presentation, I do not want to focus on the impact of climate change on the ocean, but instead take an oceanic perspective. So for illustration purposes, what you can see here is a nighttime lights map of the Gulf of Mexico, northern part. And now you can actually ask yourself, where are you actually looking at? Are you looking at this part here, the lights along the US coastline? Probably you are. But I am actually more interested in this part here, in these lights here, which, most of them are actually the outcome of offshore oil and gas drilling activities. So what you can see here is, from an oceanic perspective, the outcome of the colonization of the ocean to feed onshore energy demands. And this is a slide that I will show only for a couple of seconds. Here you can get an idea how many platforms were active in the Gulf of Mexico during the mid-2000s. So we are coming up to almost 4,000 of them. And based on that oceanic perspective, I would like to focus not on the direction depicted here, but on the opposite direction. So what is hardly analyzed by humanities and social science scholars is this opposite direction, the yellow arrow here, the ocean's impact on climate change and the transformation of the atmosphere. After all, a substantial amount of climate change causing carbon fuels are extracted from offshore oil and gas fields. And here you can actually see one of the offshore drilling platforms during nighttime, producing quite a lot of light, which explains the previous slide. What is important in terms of the emergence of climate change is that during the 20th century, offshore oil and gas drilling turned into the by far most important form of oceanic energy generation. And if we add additional human-caused biogeophysical transformations such as ocean acidification and so on, then we can talk about the idea of the Anthropocene as a proposed geological epoch in which human agency starts to influence such processes, and therefore the whole Earth system gets transformed. Among other reasons, because of the burning of carbon fuels and particularly of oil. And yeah, just to give you an idea of the relevance of offshore oil drilling. For example, during the early 1980s, such offshore oil drilling accounted for about 23% of the global oil production. And from 2005 to 2015, as you can see here, the share actually went up to about 30%. And we also need to remember that the absolute amount of oil production strongly increased since the 1980s. So if one analyzes climate change and focuses on the ocean, in the case of my presentation on the Pacific Ocean, two quite ironic developments become apparent. First one is that offshore oil drilling as one dimension of ocean colonization was a reason for the emergence of climate change and sea level rise. But now commercial and political promoters advocate its platform technology as an eco-modernist adaptation to some of the Anthropocene's negative outcomes. We talk about floating industrial sites that rise with the sea level and that are supposed to reduce human pressure on ecosystems, ranging from oceanic renewable energy generation to industrial oceanic agriculture. Anthropocene capitalists is the term that I will use for the advocates of such floating habitats or industrial combines. The term is partially inspired by Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism, but I focus on a very different problem. That is a planetary scale transformation that concerns substantial parts of humanity. And I also do not think that all related business opportunities are necessarily morally wrong, just to mention it. The commercialization of climate change and other dimensions of the Anthropocene will be one of the presentation's main topics, but in a slower way, this transformation of aquatic surfaces into colonized places is already happening since several decades. So let me give you some few examples of ocean colonization. This white structure that you can see here to the bottom is a floating container terminal in Valdez in Alaska. This is the Adriatic liquefied natural gas terminal offshore of Italy. Ecofisk offshore oil complex, Norwegian waters in the North Sea. A Japanese floating helipad for post-disaster rescue operations. That's mariculture, the offshore farming of marine organisms. Here we have the Fukushima forward floating wind turbines, which many of you will know, I think. And I hope you also know this one, or at least few of you. This is the float in the Marina Bay in Singapore, a kind of floating stadium. And in the case of marine vessels, I should mention that cruise ships provide urban conditions even outside harbors. And certain whaling and fishing vessels, here you can actually see a tuna vessel turned into floating factories that industrially process and freeze their catch already on the ocean. Here now an example for lake colonization. So this is not happening on the open ocean. That's a group of floating houses near Vancouver in Canada. And that's the last example that I want to show you. That's a group of floating houses in the IJmeer in the Dutch inland sea. So we talk about boat houses now, not Dutch houseboats anymore. In this presentation, I want to talk not only about the present situation, but also go back to the early 1970s. I will put the work and also the legacy of Japanese star architect Kikutake KIYONORI, whom you can see here, and US ocean expert John P. Craven into the global context of a colonization project that to this day focuses on moving beyond Earth's terrestrial continental limits. Kikutake, as you might know, was a member of the Japanese medievalist movement, and Craven was a marine engineer, chief scientist of the US Navy Special Projects Office, so very much involved in Cold War intelligence operations and also law of the sea jurist. I want to discuss why during the early 1970s, Craven, Kikutake, and their collaborators designed and tested two floating habitats, or two floating industrial combine prototypes in the Pacific region. The first one is the Hawaii Floating City project with a 20:1 scale floating platform model in Oahu in Hawaii. And the second one is Aquapolis, a life-size 15,000 ton semi-submersible floating habitat in Okinawa. I interpret their activities as a proto-ecomodernist project. The large-scale social and environmental transformation of marine regions was supposed to serve as an adjustment to the emerging Anthropocene's driving forces, in particular unprecedented population growth, rising food and energy demands, and rapid industrialization in urban coastal areas. However, the utilization of ocean resources was to happen by decoupling such industrial development from the overuse of ecosystem services and the related ecosystem destruction. This is what I understand as proto-ecomodernism in this presentation. Herein then lies a second irony, because during the 1970s, the idea of floating industrial combines featuring low or zero carbon energy generation that would have reduced onshore air pollution, which was the main concern at this point in time, and also one way of decoupling industrial development from ecosystem destruction, was given up by the US and Japanese government in favor of floating oil platforms, which made a major contribution to climate change in the end. So as a consequence, ocean colonization projects failed to mitigate climate change and instead rather accelerated it. process of decoupling needs to be approached from the perspective of the Japanese metabolist movement, and particularly of Kikutake, who was one of its members. However, here I want to largely focus on what I will call Hawaiian metabolism as an offspring of Japanese metabolism. Because in Hawaii, Kikutake and Craven, in a technically feasible way, which is very important when we talk about Japanese metabolism, we talk very often about quite utopian projects that people found interesting but not necessarily took seriously. So they here in Hawaii applied metabolism's principles such as mobility, modularity, and unfinished megastructures allowing growth or change in the future to the ocean's surface. So we talk about floating structures that would start with a limited size. And depending on development needs, mass-produced modular units serving different industrial purposes and being as mobile as their main structure would be towed to the main structure and be added to standardized slopes. In the case of changing needs, these modules would be switched for new ones and the old ones relocated and used elsewhere to fully utilize their lifespan. When you talk about Aquapolis, for example, then it is interesting to mention that this floating structure was actually towed more than 1,000 kilometers from the Japanese main islands to Okinawa, which shows the mobility. And I need to leave out most of the backstory that leads to Hawaii, but one of the most important industrial ocean colonization experiences was offshore oil drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. After the end of the Second World War, US oil companies extended into increasingly deeper waters in the Gulf to exploit oil fields located below the seafloor. During the 1960s, those companies began constructing semi-submersible drilling platforms, that's numbers 7 and 8 here, because conventionally fixed platforms, numbers 1 and 2, became too dangerous to operate in deeper waters because of currents, wind, and so on. Semi-submersibles then inspired plans to use this technology to construct mobile floating habitats or industrial combines. I should mention that such offshore oil drilling in the Gulf of Mexico very much represented the booming global interest in tapping ocean resources that characterized the 1960s, which was also the outcome of military and non-military seafloor surveying and Cold War oceanography related to submarine operations and so on. So during the early 1970s, Craven, Kikutake, and Hawaiian Governor John P. Burns became the protagonists of the US-Japanese project to build a prototype of a floating habitat or industrial combine. Under Democratic Governor Burns, who was in office from 1962 to 1974, Hawaii turned into a major center for marine research, which was strongly inspired by a report titled Our Nation in the Sea. That report was an outcome of the US Johnson administration's interest in the ocean and that recommended a national ocean program, similar to the outer space program that eventually led to the first moon landing in July 1969. When we talk about the idea of that eventually turned into space colonization, which is not realized but was quite booming at this point in time. And Burns, because of that, successfully convinced Craven, who was very frustrated with the new Republican administration of Richard Nixon and its total lack of interest in non-military ocean technologies, to move from the MIT to Oahu. And there, Craven assumed the office of Dean of the Marine Program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and of the State Marine Affairs Coordinator, which was a newly created office. The research project then gained additional momentum when Kikutake joined as a visiting scholar in the spring semester of 1971 and afterwards continued collaborating with Craven. And here I should mention that Kikutake was also arguably a quite frustrated person because he had, since the late 1950s, he had created plans for floating cities and so on, but these plans had not really been taken seriously by people. They had been printed in the Metabolist Manifesto and so on, but they were not really technically feasible. And when we talk about certain designs, arguably, had people lived there, this would have turned into a death trap, actually. So what is important is that in Hawaii, these ideas actually got quite realistic. In 1972, the project had progressed to the construction of an 85-ton prototype. The submerged parts of the design were strongly inspired by military designs, since Craven had been a member of the US Navy concept development team on mobile floating bases before moving to Hawaii. And a number of US institutions were researching floating modular platforms as a possible alternative to onshore military bases abroad. This needs to be understood in the context of the return of Okinawa sovereignty in 1972 to Japan, the question what would happen to the US base there, and there were also similar problems in the Philippines and other places. But separate from each other and inspired by the respective environmental problems in the US and Japanese contexts, Craven and Kikutake developed what I call the intention to create a post-industrial age onshore by industrializing the ocean. Intentions that eventually merged when the two met in Hawaii. The central aim was to provide onshore physical and mental health related public goods in the form of minimal industrial pollution, and to recreate aesthetic coastlines for leisure purposes by creating what can be called sacrifice zones in the ocean. Craven, during a public speech in early October 1970, called it the intention to turn Hawaii into, I quote, the nearest thing to paradise on Earth. And from the 1950s onward, Kikutake had addressed the same problem. So why is that the case? Well, during the 1950s, Japan's centrally planned reindustrialization had been shaped by the lack of onshore raw materials and the archipelago's mountainous geography. The Japanese government decided on an economic growth strategy that was based on strongly increasing the export of industrially manufactured goods, which necessitated the import of large amounts of raw materials and carbon fuels. So what happened to the coastlines? Well, harbor facilities that then further expanded. Then also power plants that needed cooling water. Then add heavy industry that needed cooling water. Then other industries that used the ocean to get rid of their pollution. Minamata disease might come to mind in this context. Then also add warehouses to keep transportation ways short, and also the need for flood defenses. So the emergence of such industrial combines, combinato, resulted in the loss of aesthetic coastlines and in a lot of pollution. Kikutake's idea was to move the industrial combines offshore onto oil platform-like structures. So relocate pollution, recreate aesthetic coastlines, and circumvent the problem of growing ship size and related need for harbor basin excavation. Here it should be mentioned that the idea of relocating transportation infrastructure for economic reasons to offshore locations was indeed implemented in the US, Japan, and other countries, even though not to the degree that Craven and Kikutake had in mind. What you can see here is Loop, the Louisiana offshore oil port that was decided to be constructed in 1972 and then finished in 1981. And this oil port was built to accommodate supertankers arriving from the Middle East, which were by far too large for any coastal harbors. And considering that we talk about pollution creating industries, how important actually was disaster resilience? For Kikutake, Japan being prone to natural disasters meant that disaster resilience was an essential feature of his designs and prototypes. And in the case of Aquapolis, located in shallow waters in a typhoon-prone region, Okinawa, this mobility allowed it to move in case of an approaching storm to slightly deeper waters and to be submerged up to 20 meters, which provided additional stability. So floating structures were more resilient to the kinetic energy of typhoons. When we talk about seismic shocks or earthquakes, then we also see that these have a more limited impact since the structure is not situated on solid ground. And a tsunami gets really dangerous when the wave goes up a beach, but floating structures in some distance away from the coastline are significantly less affected. And after the 2011 Fukushima disaster, Kikutake quite unsurprisingly emphasized his belief that his floating structures would have withstood the earthquakes and tsunamis force. Such disaster resilience-related considerations played a role in the construction of the first Russian floating nuclear power plant that was made operational in Murmansk in summer 2018, and this year will be towed to the Kamchatka Peninsula to replace an onshore reactor, while Russian company Rosatom sees it as a prototype for mass production. US and Chinese engineers are working on their own projects supposed to prevent another Fukushima-like accident. So part of the future of nuclear energy seems to lie offshore. But now back to the situation in Hawaii in 1970. So how was relocating transportation infrastructure and power plants offshore actually part of a broader scheme that Kikutake, Craven and Burns had in mind? I think the answer isn't too difficult. If you get rid of these pollution-producing facilities, you have not only quite aesthetic beaches, but also, as mentioned, no pollution anymore in these regions. So this is very, very helpful for the tourism industry. And this is, I think, the main reason why Burns was interested in this plan, because during his time as a governor supporting the Hawaiian tourism industry as part of Hawaii's economic development strategy was a central topic. But slightly later, from 1970 onward, the idea of relocating pollution to offshore sacrifice zones underwent a change, and Kikutake's and Craven's new proto-ecomodernist intention was to minimize pollution on these floating combines as part of a significantly larger ocean colonization scheme. So why did they add this new goal? Well, exponential population growth, one of the central driving forces of the Anthropocene, became the major reason for the attempt to move beyond the planet's terrestrial continental limits. This needs to be understood against the backdrop of a lot of writings that characterized the late 1960s, early 1970s, Hardin's The Tragedy of the Commons, or Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, or The Club of Rome's The Limits to Growth, and so on. So these writings provided the intellectual reasons, and the oil crisis a couple of years later in 1973, then the practical reasons to reconsider the role that the ocean could play in a scenario of not abandoning the idea of continuous growth. Kikutake's and Craven's project was a counter-reaction to such neo-Malthusian fears of resource depletion, ecosystem service over exploitation, and ecosystem destruction. So let me talk a bit about why Kikutake promoted ocean colonization. For Kikutake, the most precarious resource was land for cultivation purposes. In this regard, it should be mentioned that he descended from a family of landowners. And in a quite monocausal analysis published in 1959, so this is more than a decade before he went to Hawaii, struggles for control over cropland, onshore resources, and eventually whole continents had been the central reason for millennia of warfare. I quote him, "This most miserable fact, which forebodes the end of the world, is nothing else but the destiny of the civilization of continents. And this destiny had been ordained at that time when man had occupied, then clung to, and expected too much from the land," meaning Earth's onshore croplands. Notwithstanding the land did not increase, the population increased much rapidly. Seen from a trans-war perspective, Kikutake here implicitly referred to pre-war population growth discourses in Japan, where the population had more than doubled between the 1860s and the 1930s. Neo-Malthusianism and migration to colonies and other countries as a solution, instead of lowering birth rates, was one of the elements that discursively and geopolitically drove the Japanese imperial project and the expansion on the Asian continent and into the Pacific Ocean. So he could easily link it to the violent consequences. In Hawaii, in the early 1970s, his understanding of population growth nevertheless appeared much more refined than in his early, slightly utopian writings that, for example, ignored the historical expansion of land cultivation, which was actually a pretty important issue during the Tokugawa period, and also recycled pre-war geopolitical thought, even though in a very critical and libertarian way. But his and Craven's new answer to neo-Malthusianism was proto-ecomodernist ocean-related growth. So how did Kikutake and Craven intend to decouple rapid industrial development of the ocean from the overexploitation of ecosystem services? Well, one dimension was fish farming, which was illustrated, for example, by Aquapolis, featuring a fish farm with about 16,000 fish. Capture fisheries were in the process of overexploiting fish stocks that the ocean provided as an ecosystem service. So to decouple from such ecosystem overexploitation, meaning to move away from industrialized hunting and gathering to a new form of coevolution. Fish and other marine organisms should be industrially farmed in artificial miniature ecosystems largely separated from the oceanic ecosystem that then might or might not be left alone. This is also connected to the broader phenomenon of the Blue Revolution that eventually was implemented by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, which was an aquatic equivalent to the Green Evolution that was supposed to strongly increase onshore food production. And I think when we talk about the outcomes of all of that, I think it's interesting to mention that in 2016, such mariculture, so offshore farms, contributed about 29% of the biomass in tons of all commercially used marine organisms, while another 25% were bred or grown in freshwater aquacultures, meaning that capture fisheries contributed only about 46%. So this is one of the outcomes of this decoupling process, but on the other hand, I mean, it's also an outcome of the overfishing of the oceans. There's simply not that much fish available anymore to be kept caught. And as I previously mentioned, Craven and Kikutake also intended to reduce onshore pollution by relocating polluting industries offshore. But they also wanted to cut pollution, and particularly air pollution, on the floating industrial combines. According to John McNeill, photochemical smoke caused by vehicle exhausts in combination with industrial air pollution between 1960 and 2010 killed probably 30 to 40 million people, and many, many more people got non-fatal health problems. This number emphasizes the dimension of the problem that Craven and Kikutake during the early 1970s intended to tackle, even though obviously they, in contrast to us, could only guess what would happen in terms of air pollution between 1970 and the present. Craven and Kikutake focused on air pollution, but not really on climate change. But this, I should mention, is not surprising because climate change research at this point in time was just only emerging. More interesting is their general intention to design a floating megastructure that minimized fossil fuel burning to prevent air pollution, since this indirectly would have reduced climate change. We are back to the earlier mentioned ironies now. For example, Craven saw nuclear energy and oil as bridge technologies and planned to eventually generate energy via renewable energies, meaning solar power, wave power, and ocean thermal energy conversion, or OTEC, which occupied him for the rest of his life. Kikutake thought in a similar way, but for him, floating nuclear energy generation was one of the long-term solutions. I should mention that political interest and support for renewable energies temporarily intensified due to the high oil price in the aftermath of the 1973 oil shock, and outer space research showed some interest in solar energy use. But the economic viability of some forms of offshore renewable energy generation, as we probably all know, is a phenomenon of the last decade, since before that they were overshadowed by governmental support for offshore oil drilling. Craven and Kikutake also designed with the possibility to have, from the very beginning, substantial parts of the structure, the structure's floating modules submerged below the water, the equivalent to a very extensive subterranean space onshore. This very high density of the structure, as a result of combining a horizontal dimension, which is how cities normally expand, with a vertical dimension. Here you can see, for example, the columns that were supposed to host the maintenance infrastructure, and we also obviously have multi-story buildings here. So this high density was supposed to drastically reduce distances and the need for cars and trucks. And I'm sorry, I do not have the time to talk more about the related flaws and also the benefits. But I should mention that high-density urbanization is a central element in eco-modernist thought and supposed to reduce pressure on the environment that horizontal urban sprawl otherwise would cause. Kikutake and Craven were convinced of the importance of their project and the need to present a life-size prototype at the International Ocean Exposition that Japan was scheduled to host in 1975 in Okinawa. A joint Japanese-US project would symbolize friendship, but also research cooperation in industrial ocean colonization between the two countries. Considering that the exposition was closely connected to Japan in 1972, reclaiming sovereignty over Okinawa, which had been occupied by the US since 1945. The Nixon administration, whose financial support was essential, did not contribute anything. Nixon only told Craven in person that, I quote, the ocean in the Bahamas is much nicer than the ocean in Hawaii. Yeah, I've never been to the Bahamas, so I don't know. This ironically meant rejection was not too surprising, considering the Nixon administration's lack of support for non-military ocean-related research, which earlier on had encouraged the frustrated Craven to move to Hawaii. Nixon's ironically meant rejection also hints at one of the two ironies of climate change and sea level rise that I wanted to discuss in this presentation. It meant that the idea of floating industrial combines with low or zero carbon energy generation and very limited air pollution was given up in favor of a type of large floating structures that via offshore drilling made a major contribution to climate change. As a consequence, ocean colonization projects failed to mitigate some of the Anthropocene's negative outcomes, among them climate change, and instead rather accelerated them until about 1 decade ago. So if you don't see the irony yet, wait until we talk about the present situation and air pollution in Chinese cities and Chinese renewable energy generation offshore. So how about Japan? Well, Kikutake received a financial contribution of about $40 million from the Japanese government and designed the life-size prototype called Aquapolis that served as the Japanese pavilion at the International Ocean Exposition. However, being dependent on public funding meant that Kikutake needed to agree to certain conditions of Japanese ministries. In the end, Aquapolis looked much more like an offshore oil platform than like the Hawaiian design. So millions of people learned about the Japanese shipbuilding industry's new competence in building semi-submersible floating platforms like Aquapolis. We are talking about a very high impact promotion strategy. So in terms of the ironic decision to favor offshore oil drilling over offshore renewable energy generation, what were the economic reasons for the US and Japan? I think I do not need to say anything about the US and its oil industry, but I want to say a few words about Japan and oil platform construction. In 1981, Japanese shipyards indeed had gained a substantial role in the offshore rig construction business. Of the total number of active rigs, 11% had been built in Japan. However, of the 199 rigs under construction or ordered, Japanese shipbuilders' share had grown to 19%. That's almost twice the number, while US companies had remained the most important producer. And in terms of semi-submersibles, and Aquapolis had been one of them, Japanese shipbuilders even had the highest share, except in case one throws all the European companies into one pool, which is done here, but which doesn't really make much sense, I think. And I now want to move to the present and come back to the first irony. Platform-based industrial sites, de facto advancements of Kikutake's and Craven's prototypes, now are again marketed by eco-modernist promoters, the Anthropocene capitalists that I mentioned earlier, as adaptations to the Anthropocene's driving forces, such as population growth, rising energy and nutrition demands, and so on. The same topics that had already preoccupied Kikutake, Craven, and their teams. However, this time one also notices a strong focus on using floating platform technology as an adaptation to climate change and sea level rise, partially caused by offshore oil drilling and the burning of oil. And air pollution is also still or again there. The question of the economic viability of their floating industrial combines aside, they would have needed much more research funding, obviously. Kikutake and Craven's plans represent proto-ecomodernist views in favor of industrializing the ocean that look, for example, like a blueprint for the Ecomodernist Manifesto of 2015. I should mention that talking only about the problems between ecomodernist theory and practice would fill another presentation, so please excuse that I cannot do that here, but let me talk about a few examples. When we talk about high density space use, which had been something that I had in mind, this does not necessarily reduce energy consumption. And when we talk about renewable energy generation, we also talk about large-scale rare earth mining and related pollution. And there are actually plans now to get rare earths from the seafloor. So this also would be problematic because, as you probably also know, China is in control of quite a lot of rare earths, and this is not what certain countries and companies like. I should also mention that Kikutake and Craven did not at all question the idea of growth. And yeah, I'm from continental Europe. I also have certain stereotypes when I imagine a large number of Russian companies operating floating nuclear power plants in icy waters. So when we think about the way how some of the Red Navy nuclear-powered submarines were disposed by just sinking them, this is not too promising, I think. But anyway, I'm more interested in historical contingencies and in the relevance of Hawaiian metabolism today, considering that China and other countries face problems that are reminiscent of those of Japan and the US during the 1960s and early 1970s. This now brings us to the long conclusion and to air pollution. And this part is still very much work in progress, I should mention. What you see here is a very nice PR photo. This is the first floating wind turbine in the Americas that was connected to the power grid, operated by the University of Maine. And obviously, the photo does not show any form of air pollution, but a very clean sky. That's totally different from the depiction of coal power plants. And I should also mention that it is possible to actually set up offshore wind parks close to urban regions if these urban regions are located along the coastline. And in that case, not too much power gets lost over extremely long distances. So based on that, we can now move to Chinese waters and briefly talk about how China's offshore advance is supposed to reduce or even remove onshore air pollution. And here you can see an actual attempt to implement what Craven called creating a paradise on Earth. We will see if this works out or not. But in any case, offshore wind parks are supposed to reduce some of Shanghai's and other coastal cities' air pollution. Onshore renewable energy generation, when we talk about wind and solar energy, would be most efficient in China's north and west, which would result in the before-mentioned distance problem. Strong offshore winds can compensate for that, but the same problem as in the case of offshore drilling emerges. Growing distance to the coastline means not only stronger winds, but also deeper waters, where floating foundations are needed. And now we are back to the irony that offshore drilling contributed to the emergence of the Anthropocene, but also provided technologies to deal with some of its negative outcomes. The future of further intensification of climate change can be mitigated, at least compared to a scenario of continued burning of air pollution causing coal, while sea level rise is also addressed. So if the sea level rises during the course of the century and parts of Shanghai get flooded, it's actually one of the cities that is quite prone to being affected, or at least further dams and additional flood protections need to be constructed. Then the floating turbines would quite unbothered just rise together with the sea level, and maybe some floating nuclear power plants join them in the future. Same story when we talk about a region a bit more to the north, the Gulf of Jersey. So here you can see also the planning or construction of quite a number of offshore wind parks in proximity to Tianjin and Beijing. And now here you can see another form of renewable energy generation, this time located in a lake that is used for fish farming in Zhejiang province. It's a simple industrial combine that features several central elements of Craven's and Kikutake's ideas of decoupling from ecosystem services and of welding together energy generation, industrial agriculture, and high density space use by utilizing at least two layers above and below the water's surface. Last slide. What you can see here is actually the world's first semi-submersible salmon farm for about 1.5 million fish, built in China last year for a Norwegian company. This structure has, if not submerged, also roughly the size of Kikutake's Aquapolis. The next generation of it is actually supposed to be about 50% larger, and this is a couple of years away, so this is not something utopian in the future. And this is not yet a mega structure in a metabolist sense, but I think it is moving into the direction of a huge floating industrial combine, if in future versions the surface space will be used for renewable energy generation and other modules for industrial purposes such as processing and freezing of the salmon will be added. So what relevance do Kikutake and Craven and the proto-ecomodernist plans have for the future of the ocean? I think their proto-ecomodernist developmentalism is representative for the technological expansion of the human habitat into new spaces, limited not so much anymore by a horizontal land-sea divide, but more by vertical oxygen barriers at high altitudes and, more important, below the ocean's surface. Although the ocean's surface does not at all define a barrier in terms of industrialization. Moreover, what Craven and Kikutake had in mind was definitely no degrowth scenario. Rather they and the Hawaiian metabolism represent its continuous accelerating growth and drastic upscaling of the oceanic industrialization process, especially in coastal areas and shallow waters. And in the future, one probably needs to coin a new term for this oceanic development zone, most affected by marine spatial planning as a new element of geography. This also means the limited importance of sustainability, which is to be circumvented via technology. For example, this fish farm, the fish farm related to Aquapolis, is not about sustainable capture fisheries, but about industrial oceanic agriculture in an artificial miniature ecosystem only partially connected to the rest of the oceanic ecosystem. Planetary scale issues such as overfishing and also climate change aside for a moment, air pollution and energy security in China and other countries, which arguably are still judged by governments to be more important than overfishing and climate change, bring back strong memories of Japan and the US during the 1960s and early 1970s. But in the last decade, the reduced interest in carbon fuels resulted in a new wave of attempts to decouple oceanic industrial development from ecosystem service overuse and ecosystem destruction. I previously briefly addressed a few flaws in eco-modernist thought, mostly in regard to the Eco-Modernist Manifesto in 2015, and much more could be said if I had more time. But what is, in my opinion, of central importance is that the promise, and I mean promise delivery is a different story, that the large-scale industrialization of the ocean will allow continuous growth in what would then turn into a good Anthropocene and good Anthropocene capitalism instead of a more unruly Anthropocene that necessitates downscaling will be very appealing in the future to governments and decision makers, much more appealing than a degrowth-based developmentalism. I also want to emphasize again that Craven was for decades a central person in US marine engineering, while Japanese metabolism characterized an epoch in Japanese architectural and engineering history. In marine engineering, these ideas are therefore part of the discipline's history. And absorption and implementation of the proto-ecomodernist economic growth-centered ideas of Hawaiian metabolism, that is, modular designs that allow replacement and future growth of unfinished structures, but also feature mobility that allows cheaper centralized mass production, and then towering of structures to where they are needed instead of more expensive on-site construction. And also mobility in the sense of an adaptation to changing economic situations by the possibility to relocate structures, which is quite different from what you can do onshore. You cannot that easily relocate a house if it's not needed anymore, or a factory. Yeah, all these, all the absorption and the implementation of all these ideas of Hawaiian metabolism is and will continue to be a major factor in the emergence of a new eco-modernist spatial practice in the ocean, or new eco-modernist historical superstructure, if we want to use this term. Thank you very much for your attention.